Hi, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 5 demo for the piece I call Flower Child. Here we are on another character in this lineup of monster-themed characters. For this one, we went with a plant monster character guy. Now, the reason I went after this one next is because I actually have a few that are kind of hovering in the middle of being done, and this one I was just a little bit more inspired to do. I at one point thought about doing more of like a Little Shop of Horrors style monster, and I do think that that is still in the cards. I actually want it to maybe be like a companion to this guy, almost like a little plant monster dog or something like that. But for the purposes of doing these new characters, I wanted everyone to be a little bit more humanoid, just because I think it's easier to connect and kind of get excited and kind of think about what stories could be told. Don't get me wrong, I think like a big monster plant dog is kind of cool, but I just thought it'd be fun to keep it still like people, more like they are people than they are monsters or creatures. So I had the general idea of his design down almost right away. Once I started doodling him, as you could see in the sketches, he had this big missing midsection, and that came from after doodling a couple of more like Audrey 2 type monsters. I was like, oh, I still like the idea of kind of like a big mouth type thing. And so even after including that mouth type thing, that kind of just became more of an area where this like magical supercharged uber pollen is kind of floating around, and you can sort of from your own imagination imagine what could that be used for, how does he employ it, etc., etc. So with the rest of his design, you can see here I'm going in and doing a bit of a cleanup line because after that rough, I just felt like I needed a little bit more information to make sure that I nailed it. Now, his posture and his just sort of general demeanor, I was trying to kind of base it off of the idea of like a muscular, kind of like almost like a tough hippie kind of thing. Somebody who came to mind from a posture point of view, even though I wouldn't necessarily say this person is a straight up hippie, was actually Eddie Vedder. There's a bit of an Eddie Vedder vibe to this character, and it was kind of accidental at first, but then once I started seeing those qualities, I kind of leaned into it a little bit more. So you could argue that this character is almost like a plant monster Eddie Vedder, obviously with some Blanca thrown in. The funny thing about his color scheme is you can see here, because the color scheme was getting created in front of you in these this last like minute or so of footage. I didn't actually intend for this to be his color scheme, meaning like a Blanca color scheme, but it was more the notion of I wanted him to be green because he was plant based, but I didn't want him to be blue green because that was already Larry. And then when I start saying like, okay, well, what can I merge? What can I match with that yellow green? Well, what about like pink hair leaves? No, I don't want to do pink because that's also what I did for Larry. So let's pull it a little bit more orange. And then the pants ended up being brown just because I was like, let's keep them all earthy. And then when everything was said and done, I was like, okay, that's basically Blanca. But luckily, I think that he has enough there that people who really know that character, meaning Blanca, they look at this and they go, "Is this like Plant Blanca?" But I think for the most part, he's fine. His behavior and the way he would conduct himself in like combat and everything would be wildly different. He'd be all planty and doing plant stuff. So I'm not too concerned about that. To be honest, the palette just works. And I think that I could have maybe gone with some alternate plant colors. Like I could have made them blue or I could have made them purple and still pushed all of the plant stuff. But I think that two things. I think that that wouldn't be such an obvious, easy read right away. And two, we've already got a purple character, and there's actually a blue character coming next. And so I think that it was just better to hit it right in the pocket of plant and go green. And so then everything else kind of fell off after that. Like one step, it's like one thing begets the next, which is like once he's yellow green, then this color is this color, this color is this color, and then it's like, and then it's like, okay, here he is, here's his color scheme. Now, I knew that I wanted to have these other plants and flowers kind of growing on him. I didn't do specific research, but what I had in mind were like these sort of little thicker leaves almost serving as like body hair, and then these bigger flowers for accents, getting some spikes on him that are a little cactusy. Obviously the vines are a thing too, and then his hair are like these big orangey red leaves that are kind of brushed back and flowing, because he's like a he's like a hedonistic Adonis type guy, I guess you could say. I like the idea too of like this guy who I think is communicating a little bit of that vibe, but then he's also just like completely missing his midsection. Something that I want to make sure that I don't lose with any of these characters is their more monster like qualities. Even if I'm trying to do characters that resonate and are appealing, you still want to make sure that if you're doing monsters, there's a monstrous element. If I made everybody just sort of like attractive and fit and handsome and then just like blue, that's not really a that's not really something that somebody would feel was an extreme disfigurement or mutation or something like that. It's just like, oh, okay, that person's blue. So I want to still make sure that there is something in every one of these that is distinctly a monster. At one point, I had the idea of kind of merging the notion of a plant-based monster, which is to stress plant-based monster. What I should emphasize is it's like Audrey 2 was the original thought, but then it obviously went more of like a Swamp Thing vibe. So I would say that if we're going to take like Swamp Thing or Man Thing or anything like that and say that it is anything like that, and say that it is an archetype, that's the archetype, the humanoid plant man, I guess you could say. But I had an idea of merging that archetype with werewolf, in the sense that what if when there was like a full moon or some sort of equivalent event, he would actually turn into more of the Audrey 2 type creature. As fun as I still think that is, I think that's an interesting idea. I'm much more excited about the idea of him having like one or two pet like plant dogs. Now, as for the background on this character, I kind of thought it'd be funny. This is not the way that I'm going to go with it, but I thought it'd be kind of funny if he was like a plant, like literally just straight up like a flower that got planted, and then over time he became a man. I honestly think that that's really funny. Like, what if he was like a plant that was planted near like a music festival that happens every year, and like as he grew, he just like became this like hippie plant man. I think that's really funny. That's not the way I'm ultimately gonna go, because that's just a little bit too ridiculous. But I was thinking more just the classic side of like he was a dude who cared a lot about ecology and plants and all that kind of stuff, did some experimenting with things. Maybe he wasn't the one doing the experimenting, but he was helping or something like that, and then there was like an accident and he merged with it and then ran off into the jungle to live amongst his people now, his plant people. So that was kind of the premise. That one's not super original by any means, but it felt like the right way to go, just so that it was like kind of straightforward and it wasn't him being this like silly flower that grew up into a man, or that it was, I don't know, something where he was being tested on. Like, he just didn't feel like that type. He felt more like the type of character that maybe had a, oh, you'll notice that flower there, I did that with the symmetry tool and then warped it. That's why it looks kind of like perfect as far as the number of petals and all that stuff. But anyways, I think that it just makes a lot of sense to have him be somebody who cared about plants and was working towards something positive involving plants, and then became one with them. In fact, maybe the thing is that it wasn't even like an accident. He just went the direction of experimenting with plants and becoming more and more one with them, and then just kept going until he was one with them, which is fine too. I like the idea of him being really kind of just chill and zen-like, and he's just like, you know, very even-headed and very introspective, and one with the plants, of course, right? So I think that he He's a fun design. I think he worked out really well. I think that his backstory is best served being like pretty straightforward like that, especially because he doesn't really have a wildly creative design from the standpoint of like the backstory that's driving it. It's more just like he's a plant guy. His design could be cool, but he's a plant guy, as opposed to maybe like Lucy's design or some of the other characters that have like more of like a mashup of different notions. By the way, the next character, I'll put a little teaser for the next character at the end of this video, but the next character will be a little bit more straightforward as well, not really a mashup of anything, but then the character after her, I think, is a little bit more wild. So that character, I'm actually ironing out some details because I originally sketched that character and I really like the premise, but there are some aspects of the design that I want to be better. And then actually, I was talking it over with my wife. I was talking about the next character that you guys haven't seen yet over with my wife, and then she was like, that would be good on the other character. I'm trying to speak in code here, so sorry if it's confusing. And I was like, oh, that would be good. So I'm going to bring that in, and I think that character has figured itself out at this point now. So next character is going to be a little by the book as far as the type of creature, monster, mashup thing she is. And then the character after that, he's a little different. So now we've got the background sorted, for now at least, and we're going to move into the ambient occlusion phase. I actually did this part of the painting while I was watching The Godfather, which I had never seen before. I know it's a bit of a cultural blind spot for me, but I'm pretty well versed in other ways. So this is I can have the occasional blind spot, I guess. So when I'm rewatching the AO pass on this, I'm thinking about that movie, and then I watched the second one while I was finishing this piece. So the whole premise of this piece is I was painting it during watching Godfather Part 1 and 2. Everybody keeps saying that the third one sucks and that like Sofia Coppola's performance in it is terrible. Honestly, that makes me just want to watch it even more, so I'm pretty excited to see how much of a train wreck that is or is not. Maybe I'll end up loving it, I don't know, but that's on our to-do list. Since the whole quarantine thing has happened, we've been focusing on catching up on lots of movies, either old movies we've never seen or more recent movies that we wanted to see. We blew through like Parasite, which was amazing, and Knives Out, which was awesome. And last night I watched It Chapter 2, which I really liked. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 was also pretty good. I liked a lot of the way they handled those movies. Speaking of character design, I think that new version of Pennywise, the version from those movies, is an excellent design. It'd be fun to do a breakdown on that at some point, just because there's some really interesting decisions that went into that character. But anyways, so catching up on a bunch of movies and stuff lately, so we'll have to see what the next movie is that we go after. What movie will be driving the next character in the lineup? We shall see. Actually, the next character in the lineup, the one I've referenced, I was watching like almost nothing when I was working on that. I think we were trying to get through I was watching BoJack Horseman. That's what I was watching when I worked on the next character. No influence in there, though. It's not like a cow person or anything like that, although that could be funny. But so we'll have to see with the two characters from now, when I'm finishing that character, what I'm watching while I'm working on him. Maybe it'll influence things. I definitely think that this character got influenced by The Godfather because of all of the flowers. Now, that sounded really cryptic. I just mean because there's like flowers in a lot of the scenes, not because of anything else. One thing that I want to make sure that I talk about here, I don't really have the capacity right now to do like a big thorough breakdown, so I want to talk about it in words while you're watching the painting. I want to talk about the frequency of noise in a design And there are examples where the frequency is super low and examples where the frequency is super high. And sometimes it's actually good to have high noise depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And low noise is also, I prefer low noise usually. However, there's a point where low noise becomes so cartoony that your look has to support it. So I'm gonna apologize right now that I'm not gonna match too many visuals with this explanation. Consider this a primer, and if those of you out there are listening to this video and you think that this is a good primer and you want to see visuals, I will do this breakdown for you in the future. In fact, this character I think would be an excellent character to do the breakdown on, so that's why I'm talking about it here, and then we'll see if we cover it in the future. What I'm talking about when I say frequency of noise, it's the how much noise there is across the character versus grouped clusters versus just almost no noise in general. With this character, I wanted to try and hit somewhere in the middle with a little bit of a lean towards low noise. So what that means is, let's break down the elements. We've got skin body that has this little freckling happening. We've got the big gaping hole with the sparklies in the middle. We've got the vines, the individual flowers of different sizes. We've got the spikes on the shoulders. The pants I'm not really going to count because they're neutral and they fade away anyways. We've got these red sideburny petal things here. And then we've got the big orangey leaf head. So we have a lot. Oh, and the body hair. So body leaves. So we have a lot of elements here. Oh God, I should even call out the little teeth in the stomach. But anyways, so we've got a lot of elements here. What we're trying to do is we're trying to decide how we're going to contain and distribute our detail. Detail in this case, I don't mean the fidelity at which you render something. I mean the detail as in how many elements you're putting across the character and then how detailed those elements are, how detailed they feel. This isn't a hard and fast rule, but something that you can consider almost a rule is the lower frequency your elements are, which is also usually converse to the size of those elements, and it doesn't have to be, but it can be, will actually dictate how simplistic and cartoony your design feels. The more noise and the more smaller elements you have sometimes will lean towards more realistic. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that if you just litter your drawing with like lots of little specks and stuff, it'll make it feel more realistic. Let's talk about it in the context of this plant man. If this plant man were in real life, let's think of him, he would probably more realistically look like Swamp Thing. He would have like a coating of moss across his entire body, probably an even coating of some of these like little leaves, some vines all over, maybe some little flowers, maybe if there are flowers, they're kind of dotted all across him in random ways, just kind of all across his body. Depending on the version of Swamp Thing, maybe there's some wood involved in there as well. But the thing is it would be fairly even, and it would be fairly high frequency across his body. Even if you had like a few big flowers across there, you would probably also have a bunch of little flowers and a bunch of little leaves and that type of thing. If we go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, we have a character that, let's say they have a green body, and then they have like one giant flower on their left shoulder, and then maybe like a bunch of vines wrapped around their right arm or something like that. Because we're trying to concentrate our elements that are telling you that this is a plant into sort of like fewer, bigger hits. They have to be clearer, so they're going to be kind of like bigger and blown out, and they're going to be less frequent because we want the design to be more simple. So what did we try to go for here? We tried to hit something that was a little bit of a middle ground where we were getting a little bit of the best of both worlds. What do I mean by that? We've got vines and all these other elements. I was just about to list them again. We've listed them enough. We've got all of these little elements, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to find logical ways to sort of cluster them and logical places to have a little bit higher detail so that things still feel like they are kind of realistically placed. So our big, bold, cartoony design elements are the big head of leaves, which is off right now, but we'll come back to it. The big flowers the one on his shoulder, kind of the purple one, but definitely the pink one, and then the big sort of like white one that's on his right forearm. We've got these vines, but the vines, even though they're really dark and they do really stand out, they're not an extreme example because they're still green and they're still mostly tight to his body. But if we're going to highlight them, let's say that we've got the one around his neck that kind of feels like a scarf, and then the one around his arm that kind of feels like wrappings. Both arms kind of feel like wrappings to some degree. These are like our big, fat, obvious things, aside from the big bite in his stomach, but we'll get to that in a minute, because this character's success is really about balancing all of these elements. The elements that we have that are more high frequency, that are kind of about trying to show a little bit more of a naturalistic design approach, are like the cluster of flowers on his right forearm, the orange flower in the background of his right forearm, the blue flower that's nuzzled up to the white one, and then all of the little sort of like body leaves, body hair type elements, the little leaves all across the vines, and a little bit the spikes, although the spikes are admittedly cartoony because I didn't want them to be like thin and kind of disgusting. So those elements are what we're placing to try and bring some naturalistic elements into his design. Now, I would argue that I'm a very deliberate character designer. If I put something onto a character, it's usually, I try to make a statement with each one of those decisions, as opposed to a character feeling super realistic. I want them to feel designed. I want them to feel kind of cool and exciting, and that's why we're paying attention to this character instead of some other generic character that feels super realistic. So what we're doing here is we're trying to kind of pick our battles. We've got the big flowers that are these sort of like big moments across him. We've got his big plume of orange red leaf hair thing, and these are the things that are kind of giving us a bit of a regal kind of I don't know, like he's just larger than life, I guess. He's like a pretty boy slash muscly plant guy. I don't know. My words are failing me right now. But the idea is we're trying to get a little bit of stature out of the character through those things. He's not just some sort of a bruiser type. He'd be just covered in spikes and vines if that was the case. He does have some beauty to him. So that's what we're trying to bring in those elements. Then when we're trying to balance that, we're saying, okay, well, if we go back to that thought about Swamp Thing, that he's covered in moss, he has these little leaves kind of all over, then what we want to do is we want to find opportunities to do something like that. So that cluster of flowers underneath his big white flower on his right forearm, that is more haphazard. It's smaller, it's more noise, it's more frequency, but it's still clustered so that we can get a bit of a chunk happening there instead of it being scattered all across his body. Same thing with his body leaves. They are clustered where an average human male would have like chest hair and like the trail down by their belt line and stuff like that. But what we're doing is we're making them leaves instead. We want them to get that nice middle ground between feeling like hair and feeling like leaves. So we're going to have some small leaves, we're going to have some bigger leaves, we're going to cluster them into sort of groupings, but it's going to be kind of a light cluster, that it's not like a Zangief chest hair. It's like it's more realistically placed, even though they are like little leaves. And then so our vines are placed in strategic places in order to give some design elements. Like I said, the vine around his neck is kind of like a scarf, and then the other parts are kind of just placed in a way where they're like wrappings, like they're, there for a reason or something. In order to try and make those feel more naturalistic, we have the little leaves across there that are placed much more randomly. They're still placed in a way where we're doing interesting things with like silhouette from time to time, but they are there to make those vines feel like they are a little bit more natural, as well as these little vines that are kind of sprouting off, the ones that are kind of defying gravity and bending out more like a tree branch than a hanging vine. So where does that leave us in general with this character as far as its noise and all of that goes? Well, what we've attempted to do, I should say, is we've got interest clustered in spots. Because of the nature of when this piece is done, we've got like a vignetting around him, and we're through value, we're pulling the attention up to the face. We've got his face, which is perfectly framed. It's a green face framed by this bright orange leaf hairdo. Then we've got this spot of interest on his shoulder where there's a big pink flower and a purple flower. Then we've got this other spot where there's a cluster of lots of different flower types. So we're clustering them, which is a design way of containing that embellishment, but then we're hitting like 4 different types of flowers in that little cluster there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different types of flowers in that little cluster there to make it feel a little bit haphazard. We also have some supporting elements in here that are going to make things feel more naturalistic as well. We've got the green speckly freckly stuff that's happening on the outsides of his arms and up his neck a bit, and then we've got this yellow coloration that's on his hands and then running like up his stomach, up his chest, and a little bit under his neck, and then specifically on his nose. So without doing like a breakdown where I'm drawing all of these examples, what I'm trying to hopefully highlight here is that through controlling our noise and where we're placing our noise, we're doing 2 major things. We are controlling the design so that we can actually make it a design and not something that's entirely natural looking, because natural looking doesn't necessarily, it can, but it doesn't necessarily have that controlled design look. And then at the same time, what we're doing is we're trying to bring in some of that realistic vibe by having certain elements create like a little bit of randomness and chaos and make things look like they're not quite so placed like some of the other elements are. Let's catch up to where the piece is at and start talking about the process, which part of the process we're at. So we're still in the middle of the ambient occlusion phase. Something that you can see I'm doing right here, because you can see the overlapping of the shadows around the vines, is I have created a new layer that it was a shadow layer just to get the vines completely realized, to get that dark fall off around the outside without messing with anything else. Sometimes the problem with something like the turpentine brush, because it smears and it pulls, is if you have a selection and you are pulling back and forth with the smudge tool on the turpentine, you can actually be pulling from outside of a selection, and you can pull like no paint basically, which can really screw up like your edges. So occasionally, depending on the part of the piece I'm at, I will actually create like a new layer just to avoid that problem. So I'll paint outside of the area and then select inverse and clear, which is actually something that I used to do essentially all the time in Photoshop. That was like my main method, is I would paint, and the paint would all be going everywhere, and then I would select inverse and clear. A lot of people ask why I don't use like a clip mask or any of that type of stuff, and it's because I don't like it when the layers like aren't actual. I don't like it when the layers start becoming like this puzzle that you have to unwrap. And I think that that goes back to something I've mentioned in previous videos about dealing with other people's files and you passing your own files around. If I have to pass you a file and it is a complete disaster and it's super hard to work with, it's going to frustrate that next artist. In fact, sometimes an artist will just get so frustrated that they'll just merge everything together and start painting on top or something, which might not be the most efficient way of doing it, but it is in the case of having to deal with a really complex file. In the last video that I posted last week about layer management, you saw that even though my PSDs were potentially big, lots of layers and stuff like that, they're still organized very cleanly, and there's not a lot of mystery in those layers. And again, part of that is because I am used to, my background is more like studio work where I'm having to pass things around, and I don't want that type of complication to have to get passed on to some poor unfortunate artist who'll have to touch it again in the future. And sometimes that might even be true for yourself. It's probably rarer, especially in the type of pieces you see me do here on the channel, where they're just like almost like editorial illustrations that don't have to be part of a bigger project. But I do not want to have to open even an old file of my own and not know what the hell is going on and have to kind of like reverse engineer everything. So we're wrapping up the AO pass. This is the flower stage, which these layers of the file were actually pretty complicated because this character has a lot of elements, so I needed to be really smart about my layer management. And so I'm having to kind of be really careful with how these are rendered and what layers I have selected and all that kind of stuff. Those flowers in the bottom left get pretty impressionistic. They're not super precise. They didn't have to be. So again, always do the amount of work you have to do, just because you don't want to waste time on something that someone won't see and or care about, really. So this character will eventually get a lot of darkening around there, and I know that, investing tons of detail in all of that won't necessarily be worth it. It's already got a good amount of detail anyways, with the little leaves and little flowers and all that kind of stuff. Next, we're going to go into the direct light shadow, which is right there, and you can see that start getting layered in. Actually, I just realized that I was watching Toy Story 4 with my wife when I did this part, because as soon as the paint hit, I was like, oh, why am I seeing Woody in my face? I think that this whole piece actually was done, like part of it was done during Godfather, part of it was done during Toy Story 4, and then it was finished during Godfather Part 2, because we didn't want to watch Godfather back to back, like multiple nights or whatever. We already had to split it up because it's so goddamn long. So I think we ended up taking down part 1 and part 2 in 4 nights, I think is how we did it. So anyways, this is welcome to the movie review channel. Anyways, so while we are watching the direct light part go, let's talk about the character's name. This character is named Ansel, or however you want to say it. He's named after, wait for it, a hippie naming list I found on the internet, which is really the truth. Although once I saw that name, I was like, oh, that's perfectly good for Ansel Adams, since he was famous for doing a lot of wildlife and, I shouldn't say wildlife, it was more nature scenes and stuff like that, photography. So I thought that it kind of ended up working. But what I did was I was looking up hippie baby names, and I found some good ones that were pretty good. And I kind of wanted to maybe use some of them. Like there were a few that I thought were pretty good. But then once I landed on Ansel, I was like, okay, that could really work for what I'm trying to do with the character. So that's where he gets his name. That's the part that also confirms, by the way, that he is not a plant that grew up. He's a human who had like kind of hippie parents who named him Ansel, and then from there on he kind of just kept going that route. I did at one point consider like jokingly naming him something like Eddie, since I modeled parts of his sort of like aspects of him on Eddie Vedder, but I thought that that was a little too on the nose, so I decided not to do that. For the record, I'm not like weirdly obsessed with Eddie Vedder or something. It's just that it worked for this particular character. I'm actually not usually the type who's like, I'm going to sit down and design a character. Who's a famous person this needs to be based off? It just was like one thing led to another, and it worked out pretty well. Eddie Vedder seems like a complete badass, but I'm just saying that like that's not usually a part of my process. Here you can also see that we've got the pollen in his gut turned back on. Earlier you saw like a rainbow version of this. I actually did really like the idea of doing rainbow. So if you go back and you look at the characters, at the very beginning they had like a bit of a pattern, right? It was like they kind of had a primary color, and then they had a glow that was a primary color. Primary as in main, not primary like the classic sense of primary colors. Then, as I explained in Giselle's video, I wanted to kind of break that pattern and do something where the character was like entirely glowing, and we weren't really trying to pair up like a purple character with a yellow glow, similar to what we did with like Lucy. So with this character, I thought, let's keep that going a little bit more, and since he's so colorful, there's basically every color accounted for in this piece, although some more than others. I thought it'd be kind of cool if his like glowy bits was like rainbow pollen, and it kind of went towards this vibe of him being a plant. He's all about the earth, he's a hippie, it's like all inclusive. Let's represent every color, because it's just like a symbol of like he's there to support everyone and everything and all this kind of stuff. I just thought it was kind of neat. And to some degree, I don't think that it didn't work. I think it was more the notion of I wanted to kind of bring this character a little back to where the first 3 characters were, because it just felt right to me to kind of get it a little under control again after Giselle being so like kind of crazy from a color perspective. So what we did was we decided that with this guy, we'll kill the rainbow glowy bits, even though it looked cool and it fit the vibe and all that stuff, because there's so much color going on here. Let's just anchor his, like some part of him, and have that glow be a glow. Now, it was a little bit of a struggle to figure out exactly what the glow would be, but we did end up on this sort of like bluish green glow thing going on. Now, let's talk about that really quickly here. It's getting really hard on these pieces since they are ultimately fairly simplistic, character in front of colored swirly background, to get to where all the colors are copacetic. It's like these characters have really strong palettes, and then you put them on like a really colorful background, not colorful as in lots of colors, but really saturated backgrounds. And then they have to have like this glowy thing on top of it. It's like, how do we balance all this stuff? And sometimes it can be really hard. Like, what color on this would I make the background so that he stands out? I could make the background kind of like a red, which is kind of cool, because it kind of gives almost like a slightly more sinister vibe to the plant guy than what we're kind of like used to. But then again, he's also got this big orangey red hair, so that would really diminish that framing. The pink on his shoulder would also have some struggles there. Okay, well, we're not going to make it green because that diminishes all of him. So when we're starting to like make these decisions around like what colors are free for us to use, it's like, oh, well, what color have I also used before, and what color haven't I used that I should be trying out? Well, in this case, I didn't really want to go with purple because we've used purple as a background. We haven't really used blue, so then it's like I introduced blue, but then the glowy bits are a type of blue as well. So there seems to always be a point with these pieces where you're having to decide whether or not, well, basically, like, what are you going to diminish as a payment for emphasizing something else? And I think that that's actually a big part of color design anyhow. And with character design, that's a really big part. I mean, even if you just have like a character who's got like a shirt and pants and a hat and a backpack on, every time you change one of those colors, you have to take into account what does that mean for all of the other colors. Not if you're doing the more realistic character design where it's just like, okay, they're wearing jeans and most people just wear like black and gray anyway, so everything else is black and gray. But if you want a character that's unique and really stands out, if you decide that character has a purple backpack and a red shirt and yellow pants, it's like, okay, well, what about a green hat? And then it's like, oh shit, green doesn't go with it, let's adjust this and that, and then you're changing all the colors to try and make that whole thing work together. So when we're trying to figure out these backgrounds, pair them with the character, then also make sure that that glowy bit, which is usually in stark contrast to the rest of the character, that has to also fit with the background and everything. So it can actually become quite the balancing act. I think that it's easy sometimes to see a final piece and think like, oh yeah, those are the colors, because that it just kind of seems obvious. But when you're in the middle of it, there's so much minor like pushing and pulling to make sure that everything works. Does every bit of the character stand out right? Does the glow feature enough? Is the background interesting? Is everything different from the previous character? And that is the thought process behind trying to get these palettes down. The next character is a greatly reduced palette, but that's because it fits the character. But it's actually funny because I ended up deciding on a background that was similar to her glow color, and it ends up creating a pretty interesting vibe to the whole thing. So yeah, look forward to that one. So we're closing in on the end of this here. I hope that this lengthy ramble was good for y'all. If you are interested more in the process aspects of this, I recommend going back to an older video. People have been very interested in the thought process behind some of these characters, so I'm trying to emphasize that since all of these characters are going through very, very similar processes. So I recommend going back to Dead Larry or to Hazel or any of the other previous characters. As you go back, there'll be more about process, or any of the other pieces, because this follows a similar process to other things. So I hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit more about the creation of Ansel here. And the next character coming up, we'll do a quick little tease at the end of this video. So I hope you dig that. So yeah, I hope seeing all of that additional insight into design and the frequency of noise and all of that was valuable. If you really liked that and want to see an actual sort of like demo of it, please let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.